Hello, welcome to PeopleSoft channel. This is Siva. In the previous episode, I showed you different ways available to configure workflow in PeopleSoft. And as promised, today I'm going to show you how to configure workflow using Approval Workflow Engine from the scratch. Without any delay, let's get started. I have created this simple page ahead of time for which we are going to configure workflow using AWE. This is a pretty basic page where an employee can submit a stationery request at the comfort of his desk. Our requirement is once the employee submits the request, approval workflow should trigger to the following roles: supervisor, manager, and vice president. Before we start setting up things, let me quickly go behind the scene and go over my page design. Like I said, this is a simple page. I have level 0 record with one key as request ID, and I have level 1 record with an additional key to uniquely track multiple line items. Since I am not displaying line number on the page, as we have grid row counter, I am auto-populating it here at row init based on the current row number. PeopleCode here increments the line number when user clicks Add button on the grid. And lastly, I am defaulting the request ID on the header table with next and auto-generating it at the same time. By the way, if you notice, this page seems to be like a fluid page, but it is not. This is a classic page with fluid look and feel. There is a property at the component level which does this magic trick for us. I believe now you got some idea how I designed and developed this page. Now let's start preparing this page for the approval process. Alright, it's time to get our hands dirty. Let's use our transaction page for the approval purpose also. I mean, employee can request a stationery item from this specific page, and we are also going to drive our approvers to this page to approve or deny a transaction. Keep in mind, this is not a requirement. Both pages can be different. But for my demonstration, I will keep it simple. Let's use the same page for both purposes. In order to make this page fit for approval purpose, let's add few objects on this page. I will go ahead and drag approval status field on our page. We will use this field to display approval status of our current transaction. Next, I'm going to insert a delivered subpage that is going to display the lists of approvers for this specific transaction. I'll go ahead, click insert subpage, and the delivered subpage name is EOAW underscore monitor underscore SBP. We also have to select a delivered subrecord for our subpage. I'll go ahead and select it, click OK. Let me drag our subpage below our transaction. Let me add a long edit box on our approval page so that approvers can share some comments. I'll use this shortcut and I will insert the long edit box. We can use a derived work record field to capture comments. I will go ahead and select one of my derived work record field. Now I will navigate to Label tab, select text and give some static description. Click OK. Lastly, I'm going to add some push buttons on our page so that approvers can perform different actions like approve, deny, pushback, etc. I will start with submit button. I will select the shortcut. I will place my button here, double click on it. I will select my work record and the field is submit. I will navigate to label tab. I will select text and I will select the static text. I will just use the submit. I will click OK. Now I will clone this button and place other approval action buttons on the page. All our buttons are ready. Let me go ahead and save the page. And it looks like there is some error related to approval status. Let me navigate to order tab, and it looks like for some reason approval status was pushed to level 1. Let me bring it back to level 0, and I will go ahead and save our page. Once I save my changes, let me go ahead and see if my changes are reflected on the front end. I'll click add a new value. I'll click add button. It looks like all my changes are reflected on the page. Down the road, we are going to hide certain fields depending on who you are. For now, we are good. The next step in our process is to create a cross-reference table. This table will be the link between our transaction and the approval workflow process. In other words, approval process will use this specific cross-reference table to associate each specific transaction with a specific approval workflow status. Let me give you an example. This is the cross-reference table used by PO approval process. As you can see here, for a specific business unit PO ID and line number, approval workflow process is tracking the originator ID, requester ID, what is the exact approval status for that specific PO line item. Because for PO, they are doing line level approval. But in our case, we will be using just header level approval. To create a cross-reference table, the only prerequisite is we need to insert a delivered sub-record. Along with that, we need to pass the transaction keys, just like you are seeing here. That's all. We don't have to worry how data gets inserted into this table. So let's go ahead and create our cross-reference table. To create cross-reference table, I'll click on New Record. I'll go ahead and insert the delivered sub-record, and the sub-record name is UOAWXREF. And we also have to insert our transaction key. In our case, it is rec_id. And let me save. That's it. I'll click OK. And let me select the table space. Let me go ahead and build the record. In the next step, we are going to refer this table when we configure online approval workflow process. Let's go ahead and do the online configuration. The core functionality of the workflow is the approval process. With the introduction of AWE, we can configure that crucial step in the PIA. The advantage with that is we can change things on the fly without logging into App Designer. Things like who should receive notification, changing the sequence of workflow, or modifying the approval list associated with the workflow, to name a few. So let's go ahead and configure our approval process. To configure workflow for our page, I will navigate to Enterprise Components, Approvals, and Approvals. The configuration is spread across 4 different places, as you can see here. First, we can configure the user list or the approvers who should be part of the workflow. Next, we need to register our transaction page to the approval workflow engine. After that, we need to configure notifications for our workflow, and lastly, the core approval setup. Let's go ahead and perform each one of these steps one by one. I will start with user list setup. I clicked on user list setup. Let me search for existing user list, which I already created ahead of time. Like I discussed in the beginning, our request should first go to the supervisor. Once supervisor approves it, it should go to the manager, and finally vice president. Let me open one of the user list, supervisor list. If I click on that, as you can see here, we can go complex in creating approver user list. We can go by role, SQL, query, or app class. Since this is a high-level overview class, I will go by role, which means a person having this role will have the authority to approve the transaction. Let me quickly show you the other user list. I'll navigate back. For the manager, I have created a brand new role called Demo Manager and assigned this role to a user. Likewise, I did the same for Vice President user list. That's it, guys. We have knocked out one of the steps in our workflow setup. Let's move on to the next step. The next step in the process is we need to register our transaction with Approval Framework or Approval Workflow Engine. Let me give you an example. If you want to use any service, for example, internet service, first you need to register with the service provider by logging into their website and providing your information. Likewise, if you want to leverage Approval Framework, we need to access this page and provide information related to our transaction. Let's go ahead and do that. I will click on Transaction Registry. I will click on Add a New Value. We need to give some name to our approval process. Let me name it Demo Approval. I will click on Add button. I will give some description. Approval process stores all approval related information in a dedicated table that we discussed before. That is nothing but cross-reference table. Let me go ahead and provide the cross-reference table that we created before. Under notification options, there should be a flag to enable email notification that is missing here due to a PeopleSoft bug. To fix that, I have to manually update that flag using a SQL statement. It took a lot of time and effort to figure out the consequence of this missing setup. Let's check Use Email Approvals flag. Now I will expand internal URL definition. This is very important. When we send an email notification to the approver, if we want to include direct link to our transaction, that URL will be constructed based on the information that we provide here. I will go ahead and provide the URL definition that I created ahead of time. I will provide my portal name as well as the default node name. Now let's navigate to default approval component section. This is pretty straightforward. We will provide our approval component details. Next, I will expand approval event handler section. The app class that we specify here decides what should happen when approver performs different actions, like what should happen when he clicks on the approve button, deny button, pushback button, etc. Luckily, we have a delivered app class that takes care of all default actions. I'll go ahead and select the delivered approval event handler class. Lastly, let's select transaction approval levels. In our case, we are just doing header level approval. So let's go ahead and select our header record. Let's select a label ID for our request ID field. I'll select stationary request. Now I will go ahead and save our transaction registration page. Let's move to the next step, which is transaction configuration. Here we can decide what triggers the notification, who should receive the notification, and what kind of content should be on our notification. Let's go ahead and configure that. I'll click on transaction configuration. We should select our approval process. One additional benefit with AWE is adding approvers on the fly. They call it ad hoc approver. But who should be part of that ad hoc approver list? That is decided by the view that we provide here. I'll go ahead and provide a delivered view which has a list of all PeopleSoft users. The purpose of this page is to specify when a notification should be triggered and to whom. In my case, I want notification to be triggered in 3 different occasions. When requester clicks on the submit button, a notification should be triggered to the approver. The event is called route for approval. I want my second notification to be triggered when the request is approved. The notification should be sent to requester about the approval. And the event is called on final approval. And finally, when the request is denied, a notification should be sent to the requester. Let's go ahead and configure these 3 events. Let's start with our first event, route for approval. I will go ahead and provide our approval component details. Here we need to specify who should receive the notification. In our case, it's the approvers. Next, we need to select the notification template name, which defines the content of the notification. Let's go ahead and quickly create a new notification template. I will click on New Window. Now I will navigate to People Tools, Workflow, Notifications, Generic Template. I'll go ahead and add a new email template. Let's give some name to our template. Click Add. In interest of time, let me paste the email content that we plan to send to our approver. Now I will paste the subject of our email notification. Here is the main content of the email notification. As you can see here, we are passing some dynamic values to our email content. We can inject these values using a SQL definition. I will show you how to do that in a bit. The dynamic values we are passing to our email content are the request ID, the employee ID, and finally, we are passing the URL to access our specific transaction. %1 is a reserved dynamic value. No need to inject. By default, it's the URL to our specific transaction. In the template variable section, we have to specify all our dynamic values. Let's go ahead and specify them. Like I mentioned before, we need to pass the request ID and empl ID using a SQL definition. Let's go ahead and create a SQL definition. I will go ahead and create a new SQL definition to inject our dynamic values. Let me paste the SQL script. Essentially, we are fetching the request ID and empl ID from our header record. Now I will go ahead and save our SQL definition. Now I will navigate to our original transaction configuration page. All we have to do is pass our SQL definition to a specific event. This is how we pass dynamic values to our email content. By the way, we are yet to assign the email template that we created a couple of minutes back. Let's go ahead and do that. Since you got the idea about the concept, now I will go offline and create templates for other two events we discussed before. Alright, let me go ahead and do that. Alright, I am back. I followed the same process and created two more events. One is on final approval. I'm using the same SQL identifier because we are passing the same dynamic values. I created brand new templates for on final approval and on final denial. I provide the same approval component. Let me show you the template for on final approval. And secondly, this is the template I used for denial. In both of the new events, the notification should be sent to the requester, not to the approver. That's what I did here. You have to do one other important thing which is missing on my page for the system to trigger email notifications. Like I mentioned before, I have a bug in my PeopleSoft environment. You would notice an additional flag for each event for which you need to check the email checkbox. This checkbox should be checked for all the three events. If not, email notification will not be triggered to the approvers and requesters. As simple as that. That's it guys, we have completed the transaction configuration step. Let's go to the final and crucial step in our online approval configuration. Now it's time to set up our core approval process. In order to do that, I will go ahead and click on approval process setup. I will click on add a new value. We can provide several definitions for the same approval process. I'll go ahead and say version 1 and maybe I will give 0101-1900 and click add button. This is where we configure our core approval setup. Let's understand some basic rules behind our approval process. Approval process is comprised of stages, paths, and steps. Stages are executed in sequential order, and we can have several paths under one stage, and the paths are executed parallelly. When all the paths within a stage are executed, then only it will move on to the second stage. Individual approval steps are configured within a path. Like stages, steps are executed in a sequential order, but they have to fulfill the criteria, otherwise that step will be skipped. Enough of talking, let's go ahead and configure our approval workflow setup. I will start with the definition criteria. Like I mentioned before, one approval process can have multiple definition IDs. I will assume we are going to have only one definition ID, hence I will mark it always true. Let's enable alert criteria for all scenarios. Let's assign an admin role here who will have access to our workflow process just in case if there are any errors. We are just going to have one path, so let me go ahead and enable criteria for all cases. If you notice, we have criteria at different levels. They will decide if that specific level should be executed or not. We can specify this criteria either by using a record field value or a monetary value. As discussed in the beginning, I will go ahead and add 3 steps for our workflow process. I will add 2 more steps. Our workflow should be first routed to supervisor role. Next, it should be routed to the users with manager role. And finally, to the users with vice president role. If you want the workflow to be routed to vice president only when the item is laptop, you can specify the criteria here. But in my case, I want the workflow to be routed to all our 3 roles. So I will select the criteria always true in all the 3 cases. Let me save our approval configuration. Before even hooking this approval process definition to our approval page, we can test our approval setup by clicking on Preview Approval Process. I will click on Preview Approval Process. Let's plug in a user. Let's assume this user is creating the stationery request. System will automatically show how would the approval process would look like. I have the requester A. Lee, and if I click search, as you can see here, it displayed the 3 approval steps. If I click on the step number 1, here we go. This is the actual approval routing for our request. This is exactly how I want it to work. With this, we have concluded the online configuration of our workflow setup. Now let's hook this configuration to our approval page using App Designer and PeopleCode. The next step in our process is to launch our approval framework when approver opens the approval page, as well as when requester clicks on the submit button. The process is pretty straightforward, and PeopleTools delivered 2 main classes to make our job easy: Launch Manager class and Approval Manager class. We need to write code at 2 different places. Like I mentioned before, we need to launch approval framework when approver clicks on approval page, which means post build is the appropriate event. That is one event that we need to write the code. The other event is when requester clicks on the submit button or approver clicks on approve button or deny button. Hence, the second event where we need to write the code is save post change event. In interest of time, I already composed the code for post build event. Let me go ahead and paste that code here. Let me open our component post build PeopleCode. Let's change to post build, and here I will paste my code. Here I am importing the 2 main classes used by approval framework: Launch Manager and Approval Manager. Launch Manager is mainly used to launch our approval framework. Approval Manager is mainly used to manage approval process, like what should happen when a user clicks on the approve button, deny button, pushback button, etc. Here I am declaring instances of our classes, and I am instantiating the class. The most important thing is we are passing the actual online approval configuration, approval process ID, to these 2 main classes. There is a property within Approval Manager class which tells if there is already an existing workflow instance in progress. If so, then it will display the approval process monitor. If you want to add ad hoc approvers, make sure you change it to A. If there is already an existing approval instance, we don't want to display the submit buttons, hence I am hiding it. And when there is an approval instance, I want to make the page read-only so that no one can make any changes once the request has been submitted. And lastly, there is one more important property in Approval Manager class which determines if you are the approver for this current request. If so, it will display all the buttons so that you can perform different approval actions. If you are not the approver for this request, all the buttons are made invisible. This pretty much concludes post-build PeopleCode. I mentioned before that I plan to write the core approval processing logic in save post change. But how do we know if user clicked on deny button, approve button or pushback button? Let's go ahead and write some code behind those buttons just to know which button approver clicked. So I'll go ahead and open field change event. When user clicks on the submit button, I will set the submit flag to Y. I am using the method set component changed to force the save processing for every button action. Likewise, I will follow the same process for all other approver action buttons. It's time to write our save post change PeopleCode. I will open component save post change and let me paste the code. Just like post build, I am declaring the core approval framework classes. I'm accessing the same instance of class that we declared in the post build event. All I'm doing here is determining which approval action button the approver clicked. Based on that, invoking the appropriate function. I'm seeing if it is submit button, I'm just invoking the function do submit, which does the job for us. Likewise, when user clicks on the approve button, I'm just using the delivered function, which does the job for me. Likewise, deny, pushback. All I need to do is just invoke the delivered function that will take care of the processing. Likewise, if there is any description, all I need to do is call the function add comments. Once all the approval processing is done, all I am doing is calling the transfer exact function to refresh our approval page. After performing an approval action, of course there will be an approval instance, then I am displaying the approval status monitor. Let's go ahead and test our changes. I'll click add a new value. I'll select an employee ID and select some desktop. If I click on submit button, as you can see, approval workflow is generated. Let's take a step further and enhance this approval page. As you can see here, approval status is currently blank. Let's change this approval status to initial when we are creating a new approval request. Once the final approval is done, let's update the status to complete. If in case the approval request is denied, let's change the status to denied. Let's do those changes one by one. The very first change is pretty straightforward. When we are adding a new request in the row init, I can update the approval status to initial. Now let me show you what I did to accomplish the second and third tasks. Remember, on final approval, we want to change the approval status to complete. So in order to do that, I have created a custom application package and I created a class called approval handler. Basically, I'm extending the delivered approval handler that we assigned earlier in registered transactions. Basically, I assigned some default values. Approved means I am passing the value A, denied means D, pending means P. So when requester clicks on the submit button, the delivered method on process launch will execute. When this method gets executed, I added a custom method to update our approval status flag. So here in the update process flag, I'm using a SQL statement to update the status to pending. Likewise, when the final approval happens, onHeaderApprove method will execute. Just like before, this time I'm updating the approval status to approved. When the request is denied, by default it executes this method. I added an additional method which will update our custom approval status flag to denied. I hope you got some idea where I am going with this. After I am done with my custom class, all I have to do is navigate to our register transactions component and update our approval event handler class. Let's change it from delivered to our custom application package and class. I will go ahead and save our approval configuration. Alright, it's time to test our changes. Now I will log in as the requester. Now I will go ahead and create a stationary request. I will click add a new value, add, and I will select my employee ID. Notice that approval status is initial since I haven't submitted the request. These days my keyboard is not working well. Let me go ahead and request one. Now I will click on submit button. As you can see, workflow is generated with appropriate approvers. This is the email notification sent by the workflow process. As you can see, this is the stationery request for A. James. Our first approver can access the request by clicking on the hyperlink. I am logging as the first approver. Now I can write some comments. This is great. And I can approve it. Notice that first approval step is now marked as complete. Now the workflow is with Cynthia Adams. This is the email I received for the second approver. Again, I can access our transaction by clicking on the hyperlink. Now I am logging as the second approver. Cynthia can approve, deny, add comments, push back. For now, I'll go ahead and click approve. Now our request is with our final approver. Just like last time, I received an email regarding the stationery request. In order to access the approval page, all I need to do is click on the link. Now I will log in as final approver one last time. Please notice that as soon as I click approve, you will notice the approval status changes to complete because it kicks off our custom approval handler behind the scenes. I'll say approved. I will approve it. As you can see, now approval status is marked as complete. And this completes my episode 2. That's it for today, guys. If the content was helpful for you, don't forget to press that like button below. Thank you so much for watching. See you next week. Until then, keep learning.